This is BBC World News America. Reporting from Washington, I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. Hope fades in the hunt for survivors in the Genoa bridge collapse. Those who made it described their narrow escapes.
Torrential rain was coming down.
Screaming, and our daughter took her shoes off because she was just going to sleep before.
She hasn't got her glasses. We left everything in the car and we just ran for our lives.
President Trump revokes the security clearance of former CIA Director John Brennan and threatens to do the same for other former officials who've criticised him. And Hollywood glamour set in Singapore. We take a look at the film Crazy Rich Asians, which hopes to highlight diversity in film and make box office gold. Welcome to World News America. Italy's Prime Minister has issued a year-long state of emergency for the region where a bridge collapsed on Tuesday. At least 39 people were killed. The likelihood of finding more survivors in the rubble is starting to fade. The cause of the collapse isn't yet known, but criticism's already being directed at the company which operated the bridge. The BBC's James Reynolds has more from the scene.
Can there be anyone left underneath all this? To find out, rescuers will have to search under every broken concrete slab. But signs of life from beneath the rubble have now died away.
We haven't heard any cries since yesterday afternoon, but we may still find survivors.
Looking up, you can see that some vehicles have been abandoned right on the edges of the section which is still standing just ahead of the collapse. A few more seconds and those drivers would have crashed to the ground. They were all incredibly lucky to survive. Nicola and Lisa Henton-Mitchell from Oxfordshire were here on holiday with their two kids. They told me they were driving towards the bridge when they saw a commotion up ahead.
People started shouting, waving their arms to reverse out the windows and
tooting horns and everything like that, and so we tried to reverse and we couldn't go anywhere, and the car in front hit the front of our car, and then people were running, screaming in Italian, run,
out, cars.
So we just literally, kids run, because we didn't know what was happening. We made our son just run, and we sort of grabbed our daughter's hand and started running, but we couldn't pick her up because all the car doors were flying open, people everywhere, torrential rain was coming down.
Screaming, and our daughter took her shoes off because she was just going to sleep before.
She hasn't got her glasses. We left everything in the car and we just ran for our lives.
They took shelter in a motorway tunnel and waited for help. Many other drivers ahead of them lost their lives. The victims include Roberto Robiano, his wife Ercilia, and their 7-year-old son Samuel. Andrea Cerulli was 48. He had a young son. He was killed on his way to work. 35-year-old father of 4, Luigi Matti Altadonna, was driving his work van. Matteo Bentornati, Giovanni Battiloro, Gerardo Esposito and Antonio Stanzione were all in their 20s and on their way to Spain. They'd originally planned to fly, but they ended up hiring a car instead. The country's Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, in just his 3rd month as Italy's leader, promises immediate steps.
These are unacceptable tragedies that should not happen in a modern society. This government will do everything to prevent such tragedies from happening again.
But this has been promised before. Yet for years, successive governments failed to fix Italy's crumbling infrastructure. Many Italians will ask why this new administration should be any different.
Lawyers made their final arguments today in the trial of President Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. Mr. Manafort's been charged with multiple counts of tax and bank fraud, which he denies. The case isn't related to his work for the Trump campaign. Well, for the latest, we can now go live to Chris Buckler, who's outside the court in Alexandria, Virginia. Chris, the case has wrapped up today. What did we hear in the closing arguments?
Yeah, final statements from both the prosecution and the defence teams are now complete, and it is up to the jury. And during both of those arguments, there was a lot of discussion about the star witness in this case, a man called Rick Gates. Now, Rick Gates was Paul Manafort's former business associate. He was his right-hand man. He was someone who worked extremely closely with him, and he's someone who has already pleaded guilty to a number of crimes. As a result, he is giving testimony here as part of a plea deal. And that has led the defence to raise a number of questions about him. They say he's a liar. They say that he's only interested in taking away some of his sentence and getting it reduced. And they said specifically that he's someone who had his hand in the cookie jar, specifically saying that he had admitted stealing from Paul Manafort himself. On the other hand, the prosecution have been very, very strong in saying that the star witness really shouldn't be seen as Rick Gates, but the documents in this case. And of course, Paul Manafort is accused of hiding money that he made in Ukraine, working for pro-Russian parties, some tens of millions of dollars in a series of different foreign bank accounts. They say, look at the documents. And they say, don't talk about this as having a hand in a cookie jar. This was actually a huge dumpster of money that was hidden abroad.
Now, this case doesn't relate to the work that either men did for the Trump campaign, but how concerned should Donald Trump be? How closely should he be watching the verdict?
Yeah, of course, the special counsel is looking into these allegations of Russian interference and potential collusion in the 2016 presidential election. But this is a separate part of his investigation. It's something that was essentially an offshoot from it. It all predates Paul Manafort's time for working for Donald Trump. Nonetheless, it is very clear that the president has been watching this trial extremely closely. It's been taking place here in Alexandria, not that far from Washington, and the White House has been monitoring events. At times, Donald Trump has even made comments. He has tweeted about this case, and he has suggested, for example, that Paul Manafort is not being treated fairly in this case. It does give you a real sense that there is a pressure on both Paul Manafort and Robert Mueller as the jury start their deliberations.
And briefly, you say the jury start their deliberations. It's impossible to measure a piece of string, but when do you think we might get a verdict?
Well, the question is whether or not they do have a trouble with Rick Gates. I think a lot of the conversation will be about him. They will certainly look at some of the detailed evidence that has been given here, some of the documents, some of the email trails, but they'll also have to consider Rick Gates and see whether or not that they do feel that a man who has stolen from his one-time business associate and who admitted to affairs is someone they can trust. But as I say, the prosecution is trying to make this much, much wider.
Chris Buckler from the court, thanks very much for joining us. Now let's return to our top story, the anger and aftermath of the bridge collapse in Italy. We can now cross live to James Reynolds, who is in Genoa. Firstly, James, what's the latest in those rescue efforts?
The government said that it can confirm that 39 people have been killed. The recovery effort carries on behind me. You can probably see the area of the collapse has been floodlit. We're hearing from our distance about 200 metres away the sound of drilling. We've seen plenty of exhausted looking firefighters walking by. One I spoke to a little earlier said that they hadn't heard voices since yesterday afternoon. That's more than 24 hours. So signs of life have been dying away.
And now, of course, James, questions are being asked about how this could have happened. Questions over the safety procedures which were in place to maintain that bridge. What more can you tell us about that?
A criminal investigation will be launched by the prosecutor's office here in Genoa, which will deal with all that. There is, of course, plenty of speculation from informed experts as well as members of the public about why the bridge collapsed. Was it something to do with negligence? Was there not enough oversight on behalf of the Italian authorities? Was there something wrong with the actual procedures of the operator, or were those procedures simply not followed? These will all be questions for the public prosecutor.
And James, as well, there is now a state of emergency in that region. What does that actually mean going forward for the next 12 months, I understand?
That's a technical step which allows the Prime Minister to access special funds in order, from his point of view, to try to make this area safe and to rebuild transport connections. The A10 that this bridge was behind me, the name of the road, connected Genoa to the Italian Riviera and beyond that to France, to the city of Nice as well. This was a vital transport link. Italy wants to rebuild it in a safe way.
James Reynolds, thanks very much for the latest there. Now, the White House today broke with tradition and revoked the security clearance of a former CIA director. John Brennan's been highly critical of President Trump on Twitter. In response, he tweeted today that the president's actions should gravely worry all Americans, including intelligence professionals, about the cost of speaking out. My principles, he said, are worth far more than clearances. I will not relent. Now, historically, officials who've served in office often keep their access in order to weigh in on security matters and speak with their replacements. While speaking on behalf of the president, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders named a number of other officials she said could also have their clearance revoked.
As part of this review, I am evaluating action with respect to the following individuals: James Clapper, James Comey, Michael Hayden, Sally Yates, Susan Rice, Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, and Bruce Orr. Security clearances for those who still have them may be revoked, and those who have already lost their security clearance may not be able to have it reinstated.
Now, if some of those names sound familiar, it's because they've crossed swords with Mr. Trump over a variety of issues and have often drawn his scorn online. Well, for more on all of that, I spoke a short time ago with Shelby Holliday, a video reporter at The Wall Street Journal. Shelby Holliday, great to have you with us. As we saw just then, Sarah Sanders saying that the president is revoking the security clearance of one former official, threatening to do it with a number of others as well. Why now?
Well, we do know that the official whose security clearance he is revoking was speaking negatively about the president last night. He has been very critical of the president on Twitter. So it might have something to do with timing. The president obviously does not like any sort of criticism in the press, whether it's on social media, whether it's on television. So that's one thing. But he also, in revoking this clearance, cited something that has to do with Russia, which is the dossier. So that is part of the reason that Brennan is having his security clearance revoked. And that does have to do with an ongoing investigation. He also cited other people with knowledge of the Russia investigation, including Comey, Sally Yates, Andrew McCabe. These are all people who not only are critical of the president, but who also may have very valuable witness testimony later on in the scheme of this Russia investigation.
Many people are saying the timing of this is also a way to divert attention from the news cycle 24 hours ago when we were talking about allegations made in his former advisor Omarosa Manigault's book.
I think that's a really important point because obviously the White House is trying to shift the news cycle, and that's something they do very well. The president can jump from subject to subject with a simple tweet or a simple statement like we saw today. But one thing that is important is he's revoking a security clearance of somebody at the same time the White House is dealing with a hemorrhage of sensitive information, tapes that were recorded inside the Situation Room and other parts of the West Wing, and this big press tour, a very public, ugly spilling out of secrets from Omarosa. So, you know, when you're looking at White House security and security clearances, it is an interesting time to be revoking security clearances while simultaneously dealing with a huge fallout like this.
You've been covering the Paul Manafort trial quite extensively. That's now wrapped up in terms of evidence that we will hear. It's not directly related to Mr. Manafort's work on the Trump campaign, but how relevant is it to the wider Russia investigation?
I think when you look at some of the exhibits that were uploaded by the special counsel and some of the evidence that was used in court, there are some tea leaves you could read in terms of what's to come. For example, Paul Manafort was constantly emailing with a man named Konstantin Kilimnik. Konstantin Kilimnik is named by the special counsel as having ties to Russian intelligence. And he visited Paul Manafort multiple times in 2016 while Manafort was running Trump's campaign. So there are a lot of questions about what they were discussing and what sort of knowledge Manafort may have had about Russia's hacked emails at the time. And there's also a lot of evidence that Paul Manafort was in a very precarious financial situation in 2016. There's an email that shows he couldn't pay his credit card bills. He was scrambling to get loans. He even promised a banking executive a position in Trump's White House if he extended him $16 million in loans. So I think when you look at the grand scheme of things and how much trouble Paul Manafort was in, it raises a lot of questions about what he did to get whole, as he said in an email, with Russian oligarchs or possibly even Russian officials.
Shelby Holliday, so much to discuss as always. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Turkey's weakened currency, the lira, rallied slightly today after President Erdogan raised duties on US cars, alcohol and tobacco. It followed America's doubling of tariffs on Turkish metals last week. The two countries have been at odds over Turkey's refusal to free an American pastor who's imprisoned there. In Afghanistan, 48 people have been killed and 67 injured in a bomb explosion at an education centre in the capital, Kabul. Many of the victims are believed to be teenagers who were preparing for their university entrance exams. The Taliban has denied involvement. Our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins reports.
After all the decades of conflict in Afghanistan, another horror. Young people, teenagers, the country's future, deliberately targeted by a suicide bomber who simply walked into their class as they studied for university.
My brother was studying at the education centre and he was killed in the blast. I'm here to receive his body.
Two of them were injured, as I have seen, but most of them, unfortunately, they have been killed.
The Taliban deny attacking the school. It's more likely to have been the work of so-called Islamic State or Daesh. My colleague in Afghanistan, Shwaib Sharifi, described what happened.
The police says suicide bomber was on foot and entered through this centre into this very big classroom housing at least up to 100 students, boys and girls. And the suicide bomber, according to the eyewitnesses, reached here and detonated his explosives.
It's been a horrific year in Afghanistan, even by the standards of a very bloody conflict. The United Nations says 1,692 civilians were killed in the first 6 months of this year. That's a record high since they started collating figures in 2009. The government is still battling to get control of many areas of Afghanistan. They do hold these areas shown in grey, but those shown in red are held by insurgents, and those in yellow are fiercely contested. It's still a grim picture, and attempts to launch peace talks with the Taliban are faltering at best. In recent days, the Taliban demonstrated its strength, seizing large parts of the city of Ghazni before being pushed back. But officials say at least 100 government soldiers were killed, adding to huge Afghan losses since US-led NATO troops pulled out of the country in 2014. It's led to intense doubt in Washington about the way ahead, and to Britain sending over 400 extra troops back to Afghanistan, but to train and support, not to fight. One task is simply to move international advisors around Kabul and try to protect them from attack. But the much wider struggle to help the Afghan government strengthen its fragile hold on the country, that's very far from being won. James Robbins, BBC News.
You're watching BBC World News America. Still to come on tonight's programme. A BBC investigation into rhino horn poaching in South Africa and how official corruption plays a part.
You've done a lot of tosh.
I wondered how long it would be before we got on to hard.
Why do you want to play this game anymore?
It's my life.
You can insult me on television, but I actually work for the President of the United States. There was hate for a while.
We don't need to go there.
Stephen, have you finished? Now, let me tell you that you are wrong.
I like somebody that asks me the hard questions we should all be giving hard answers to.
Hard Talk on BBC World News.
A BBC investigation into rhino poaching in South Africa has found that it's not just the consumers or traffickers who are to blame, but also corruption. More than 1,000 rhinos are killed every year in South Africa. Their horns are used as a medical remedy or increasingly as a status symbol in Asia. Our Africa correspondent Alistair Leithhead sent us this report.
Thousands of rhinos have been killed in South Africa in the past few years. and there are allegations of a link between the poachers and court officials.
In Zululand, it's a cesspit of corruption. It's massive.
Jamie Joseph is a conservationist, activist and investigator who says she's uncovered evidence of corruption.
Inside the courthouse, there is an alleged syndicate of magistrates and prosecutors that are taking bribes in rhino poaching cases.
This police informer claims his uncle, a lawyer he worked for, was part of a large corrupt syndicate, and that his job was delivering bribes from poaching kingpins to court officials.
I would give money to most of his friends, and most of his friends are magistrates, lawyers, prosecutors. If you want your case to be withdrawn, or if you want everything to just disappear, you just go to him.
Fresh passed a lie detector test. His uncle, Welcome Ngwenya, denies the allegations. But Fresh says the syndicate involved Dumisani Gwala, a suspected rhino horn kingpin, whose trial has been delayed for 3 years after more than 20 court appearances. Mr. Gwala, are you the rhino horn kingpin that people are making you out to be? Mr. Gwala, have you dealt in rhino horn? Are you being protected by officials in South Africa? And there are separate allegations of a corrupt syndicate of court officials in a confidential report to the Magistrates Commission, seen by the BBC, concerning alleged payments for appointments. It found Eric Nzimande, the most senior magistrate in KwaZulu-Natal, received money from Fresh's uncle Ngwenya, as well as other magistrates. The report says it appears to have a pattern of racketeering activity. Mr. Nzimande denies any wrongdoing and said he would not respond unless formal charges were laid against him. The Commission and the police are investigating. Corruption is a word often used in South Africa, but one of its veteran Zulu politicians fears it's wiping out the rhinos.
I mean, they are one of a species, but it seems to me they want to completely eliminate them from the face of the earth. So, I mean, the whole of South Africa, reeks, if I may say so, with corruption.
As more rhinos are killed, the number of orphans left behind is increasing. Unless demand is stopped in Asia and corruption tackled here, they're heading towards extinction. Alistair Leithhead, BBC News, Zululand.
Now, starting today, US moviegoers will be able to watch something they haven't seen in a quarter of a century. A modern studio film led by an all-Asian cast. Crazy Rich Asians is a romantic comedy with plenty of Hollywood glamour, except it's set in Singapore. Experts say its performance at the box office will be a litmus test for future films, as Tom Brooke reports.
What about us taking an adventure east?
Like Queens?
Singapore.
Crazy Rich Asians, inspired by a bestseller, tells the story of Rachel, a Chinese-American professor in New York who travels with her Oxford-educated boyfriend to meet his family in Singapore, where he was born. There she discovers, to her amazement, that he's Singapore's most eligible bachelor and heir to a fortune. This romantic comedy chronicles her immersion into a world of extreme affluence and her tense relationship with her boyfriend's mother.
She just thinks you're some, unrefined banana.
No. Those are a few fingers.
Yellow on the outside or white on the inside.
Asian Americans who've been to advanced screenings of the film in New York have been responding enthusiastically, viewing it as validating.
I've lived here almost my entire life, although I was born in China, and I've never seen a film that has an Asian cast and has them portrayed in such diverse ways and so glamorously.
Crazy Rich Asians stands in stark contrast to most Hollywood films where there's a dearth of Asian stories and characters. One survey has found among top recent Hollywood films, Asians represented less than around 1 in 20 of all speaking characters.
Don't you want Nick to be happy?
I know you're not what Nick needs.
And often the Asian characters that do appear on screen reinforce negative stereotypes. Crazy Rich Asians tries to deliver more rounded, authentic depictions of Asian men and women.
Ever since I can remember, my family has been my whole life. Rachel.
Crazy Rich Asians has been the target of some protest. There were complaints that the leading man, who has a white British father and Malaysian mother, wasn't Asian enough for this Asian-led film. There's also been some complaint over the representation of Singapore in the film, that the local Malay and Indian populations have been ignored.
For the criticism where it comes to, there's not a lot of sort of brown figures or actors or people from Malaysia or India in the film, absolutely, there isn't enough. There should be more of these films to be able to represent everybody. But again, this is a step in the right direction.
Clearly, there's a lot riding on Crazy Rich Asians. Its performance at the box office is going to be closely watched.
Its success at the box office will sort of pave the way or open doors for other films that are sort of waiting in queue to be green-lighted from production companies to be distributed, to be funded.
Rachel, these people aren't just rich, okay? They're crazy rich.
The release of Crazy Rich Asians has been described as a watershed moment for Asian representation. Right now, the portents look good. The film has been getting strong media exposure, and it's been earning some very positive reviews. Tom Brooke, BBC News, New York.
And Henry Golding, who's the lead actor in that film, who you saw in that report, has worked for BBC World's travel show, which means there's hope for my Hollywood career just yet. If you want to give me any Hollywood offers, you can find me on Twitter at BBC Rajini V. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.
Hello there. We've got some wet weather set to move into northwest Europe over the next 24 hours. Now,